So today we are going to do some advanced grammar, and this is actually perfect because yesterday we did the past perfect continuous, and before that we did the past perfect, and you need to know past perfect construction to do the third conditional. Okay, so we call conditionals conditionals because there are two different clauses. Hold on, let me grab a pen. There are two different clauses together to form a complex sentence. So we have a dependent clause and an independent clause. So the third conditional is almost always a complex sentence. Meaning it is a dependent clause plus an independent clause. Okay, so the first clause, the dependent clause, we know it is dependent because it begins with if, and if is a subordinate. So it means that this clause here is dependent. And then we have a second clause, and it is an independent clause. And in this clause, we have the structure of would, have, plus the past participle of the main verb. So this is like, for a lot of students, because of the heavy use of the past perfect and have and the past participle, a lot of students are like, whoa, this is too complicated for me. But it's kind of not. And we're going to talk about that today. Okay, so why do we use the third conditional? We often use conditional sentences for hypothetical situations. And by hypothetical situations, I mean we use conditional sentences, especially the second and the third conditional. We use them to discuss like different realities, right? We use them to discuss, like, if this were to happen, what would the hypothetical or imaginary result be? So that's kind of the second conditional. Like, if I won $1 million, I would buy an apartment in Paris, France. So this is an hypothetical situation. It is an unreal situation. But if I create with the dependent clause, I create an unreal situation. If I won $1 million, then I have to have an unreal result. And that's the independent clause. I would buy an apartment in Paris. So some people call this the if clause and this one the result clause. And so if that's an easier way for you to think about it, then you can think about it that way. If clause, result clause. But we have the language noted now that this is a dependent clause and this is an independent clause. Okay, so the third conditional specifically is generally used to talk about the past. So the second conditional, if I won $1 million, what would I do? I would buy an apartment in Paris. This is completely unreal. Like, it's not based in any reality. You're just imagining a situation. But the difference between the second conditional and the third conditional is the third conditional, we're kind of half talking about reality. So in the if clause, we're discussing an event in the past. And we're discussing what the past would look like if something different had happened than what actually happened. And then if something in your past was different, there would be a different result in your life, right? Like if we went in a time machine and like went back to the past and we changed something, and your life would change. There would be a different result in your life. So we use the third conditional to talk about like different possibilities in your past. Let's put it that way. Different possibilities in your past. But while we're talking about different possibilities in our past, we probably should talk about regret. Often, this tense is used to express regret, saying basically like, if I had or hadn't done this thing in my past, the result wouldn't have been X, Y, and Z. So a lot of people use this to talk about things they wish were different about their past. That's another good, clear explanation. You use the third conditional to talk about the ways you wish your past had been different. Okay. So we'll talk a little bit more. I'll give you some more examples about like what this looks like when discussing regret in a minute. Yeah, so we're talking here usually about past life decisions, and if you had changed these past life decisions, what would the different result of your life be? All right, so just to be clear, the structure for this conditional is dependent clause, if plus the past perfect. So the past perfect is had plus PP, past participle. And then we have the subject here plus would plus have plus past participle of your main verb in that clause. Seems complicated, but let's look at some examples. Okay. So let's look at an example. So this is an example from my real life, so that makes this easier. Can you see that? I'm so sorry about the window. Okay, hopefully that's better. Okay, so things you need to know about me. I lived in England for 5 years, and in that time I studied to get a psychology degree. So I got my master's in psychology, and my plan was to apply to a PhD program and become a clinical psychologist. That was my plan. But life changes, and for lots of different reasons, I had to move back to Canada before I could get my PhD. And as I explained to you guys before, my degree is not recognized in Canada. So I wanted to be a therapist in England, but I am not a therapist, and I now live in Canada. But this is a regret of mine. Like, even though I love being a teacher, I studied and worked really, really hard to get this degree, and I really, really wanted my job to be a therapist. So this is a regret. Like, this is something I kind of wish was different about my past. So we need to know some facts first. 1, I didn't stay in England because I am now in Canada. Okay. 2, I'm not a therapist. I am a teacher. So these two things are what is true about my life. But we're going to use a third conditional to discuss like how I wish my past had been different. Okay. So first, let's look at the if clause or the dependent clause. So we have if, and then we have our subject here. So if I had stayed in England, so here you will recognize this as being the past perfect. This is the past perfect if I had stayed. So we have the subject plus had plus the past participle. So if I had stayed in England, so this is my dependent clause. And the dependent clause is always the opposite of what really actually happened in your life. So I didn't stay in England. But if I had stayed in England, if I had made a different choice, if I had not moved to Canada, so if I had stayed in England, you'll notice a comma, I would have become a therapist. So this, starting here, is our dependent clause. Independent clause or results clause. So we have our subject, would, plus have, plus the past participle of our main verb. I would have become a therapist. So this is the opposite of what actually happened in my life in your dependent clause. And then in the result clause, we give the like different potential past result if we had made a different decision. So if I had stayed in England, I didn't, but if I had stayed in England, I would be a therapist, but I'm not a therapist because I didn't stay in England. So that is how you make the third conditional. Okay, let's take a look at a different example. Okay, let's look at one more example. A little more complicated. Same structure though. So we have our if clause or our dependent clause, and we have our independent clause or results clause. But this one is more related to us, like you guys as my students and me. So if there hadn't been a pandemic, right? So there is a pandemic and there was a pandemic, but if there hadn't been a pandemic, so we're imagining a different situation in the past. Like if there hadn't been a pandemic. Okay, so if is if, and then there is our subject. Okay, and then we have our past perfect, hadn't been. But the past perfect is in the negative. So that's okay. Negative, positive, not a problem. Because sometimes we're talking about something that didn't happen and we wish it did happen. And sometimes we're talking about something that did happen and we wish didn't happen. Both are possible, right? So you can use the positive or the negative in this clause. Okay, again, we have our comma between the two. So if there hadn't been a pandemic, there was. But if there hadn't been, we would have learned this at Fanshawe College, right? So if there hadn't been a pandemic, we would all be in a classroom together at Fanshawe College. I could see your face. You could see my face. It would be great. But that's not true. So this is a different past event, and this is the different potential result of that event. Okay. So I'm going to give you some homework. I'm going to write it in the announcements, and I want to see you guys practice this a little bit. All right. Have a really great day, and I will see you next Tuesday. Bye.